Okay, we're going to look at the topic mutations. Do they have enough power for evolution to be true? And I look at it as a detective, and what I do is I use common sense and what I've experienced in my life and different things. But I have scientists that come to other conclusions, and I see ones that are consistent with me and what I believe to be truth. It's not necessarily what the Bible says, because as a detective, you have to put that aside. And so most Christians believe in evolution today, so I don't have a problem believing in evolution as far as being a Christian. I just want to go with what is the truth, and that's what a detective does. And so most people just think that evolution is true, so they don't question evolution, but that's how you do science. You question everything and you never stop questioning things. So Darwin's story of evolution has not changed. Life started in the sea and it evolved, and the fish came on land, and then they evolved to humans there. And anyway, then they went back to the sea and evolved into whales, supposedly. And anyway, that's the basic story, and this is all done by mutations, and it has not changed. Actually, it goes back to the ancient pagans, the earliest writings we have. They believed in this basic life starting in the sea and coming onto land type story. When Darwin came up with this scientific fact of evolution, he thought the powers of change was pangenesis. This was proven wrong by the early 1900s, but evolution was a scientific fact, so that wasn't a problem. So they didn't think like maybe we better get rid of Darwinian story, but no, just because they didn't have a power, they just kept trusting the story that evolution would evolve another answer for the question, and pangenesis, he got it from Lamarck. By the 1930s, they found mutations can change the composition of the DNA, so they proposed that they'd found the missing power source, that pangenesis was abandoned and mutations took its place. And so this became neo-Darwinian evolution, and mutations became the power. And they have other little powers and natural selection that they talk about a lot. They don't talk about mutations so much anymore, but that really has no power. And gene drift and all these other little things, they don't really have power to change, just to modify. Scientists turn to neo-Darwinianism in the hope that it could do that which Darwinism could not do. The man more responsible than any other for getting scientists on the neo-Darwinian bandwagon was Julian Huxley, but in his writings he uh, knew he was on thin ice. And I've got a bunch of quotes here from Julian Huxley. And here's the first one. It says, a proportion of favorable mutations of 1 in 1,000 does not sound like much, but it's probably generous since so many mutations are lethal, preventing the organism from living at all. And the great majority of the rest throw the machinery slightly out of gear. They talk about neutral mutations. Well, the body's able to adapt to them is all they are, but they're all putting the genes out of gear. And he's right there. Another quote from him: one would expect that any interference with such a complicated piece of chemical machinery as the genetic constitution would result in damage, and in fact, that is so. The great majority of mutant genes are harmful in their effects on the organism. They cause all kinds of problems. They cause cancer, they cause heart disease, they cause mental problems, an array of problems, thousands of problems. Ernest Mayr, he's one of the early ones who was involved in this. The occurrence of the genetic monstrosities by mutation is well substantiated, but they are such evident freaks that these monsters can be designated only as hopeless. They are so utterly unbalanced that they would not have the slightest chance of escaping elimination through stabilization selection. The more drastically a mutation affects the phenotype, the more likely it is to reduce fitness. To believe that such a drastic mutation could produce a variable new type is equivalent to believing in miracles. So they believe in miracles. They say we believe in miracles. They believe in miracles. So mutations, we're going to talk about them and their copying errors. Here's the definition. Mutations are accidental copying errors in the DNA and RNA transcription copying process that lead to structural damage. That's what they do. Actually, the RNA is set up, it'll stop spinning at like 75,000 RPMs and go back when it makes a mistake and fixes it. And then after it's over, there's in our cells they have three different molecular machines that go over the DNA, and they all look for copying errors. They try to and they fix the mutation. Somehow this all came together by mutations, I guess. So the prime axiom states that the natural selection of unguided random mutation has taken life from that first cellular organisms to the great genetic diversity we see on our planet today. So that's what they say. Mutations did all this, and praise mutations, I guess. We'll look a bit more. So are they the engine of evolution? Ernest Mayr says, it must not be forgotten that mutation is the ultimate source of all genetic variation found in natural populations and the only new material available for natural selection to work on. Another quote from C.H. Waddington, it remains true to say that we know of no other way other than random mutations by which new hereditary variation comes into being, nor any process other than natural selection by which the heredity constitution of a population changes from one generation to the next. So mutations are the power, the main power. And natural selection has no power. It's like who are the survival of the survivors. So there's different types of them. I'll go over quickly. Deletion moves the chromosome segment. So here it's got D is moved over. This is a deletion, so D is removed. And a duplication repeats a segment, and there's BC is duplicated in the new mutation. Inversion reverses a segment with a chromosome, and there's backward version of D, C, and B. And translocation moves a segment from one chromosome to another non-homogeneous one. So see, it's moved to a different whole part. Can mutations create new information is the big question. Well, there were a lot of mutations after the Chernobyl event, and here we see a big advantage from a mutation for a cow. 2 extra legs. 2 extra heads in this creature, donkey or whatever it is. Deer with 2 extra legs. Turtle with 2 heads. And fly has a leg in the place of an antenna. And instead of the halter, they got new wings. And so in a fly. These examples and all other examples of mutation-enhanced function quoted in the scientific literature involves loss, jamming, or mere duplication of genetic information. No novel, more complex genetic information that adds higher level of function has been added to these organisms. So the extra set of wings, that fly couldn't fly, and all the extra legs, they just got in the way. Four special problems with mutations. One is rare effects. Mutations are very rare. This point is not a guess, but a scientific fact observed by experts in the field. Their very rarity dooms the possibility of mutational evolution to oblivion. So what they say is, well, mutations just happen like one every million or 10 million or whatever, but your body is making millions of cells every day, but it would have to happen to one cell um, repeatedly for these type of changes. And just because there's so many mutations and they're so rare that because they're fixable by the internal workings of a cell. Here's a quote. It is probably fair to estimate the frequency of a majority of mutations in higher organisms between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million per gene per generation. So genes, they go fast, but they just are not frequent enough to get them into one cell. Rare random effects. Mutations are always random and never purposeful or directed. This has repeatedly been observed in actual experiments with mutations. Here's Pierre Jean Grassi. The opportune appearance of mutations permitting animals and plants to meet their needs seems hard to believe, yet the Darwinian theory is even more demanding. A single plant, a single animal would require thousands and thousands of lucky appropriate events. Thus, miracles would become the rule. Events with an infinitesimal possibility could not fail to occur. There is no law against daydreaming, but science must not indulge in it. This whole idea that this happened is daydreaming, is what he says. Third problem is not helpful. Evolution requires improvement. Mutations do not help or improve, they only weaken and injure. Even assuming that all mutations were beneficial, in order for evolution to begin to occur in even a small way, it would be necessary to have not just one, but a series of closely related and interlocking mutations, all occurring at the same time in the same organism. This is a quote from Evolutionist Facts. The odds of getting two mutations that are in some slight manner related to one another is the product of two separate mutations. 10 million times 10 million, or 100 trillion, that is 1 followed by 14 zeros. In scientific notation, it's written as 1 in 10 to the 14th. What can two mutations, if they happen by this strange possibility? Perhaps a honeybee with a wavy edge on a bent wing, but he is still a honeybee. He has not changed from one species to another. So these mutations are just not going to happen the way that they hope they would happen. Hundreds of thousands of mutation experiments have been done in a determined effort to prove the possibility of evolution by mutations, and this is what they've learned. Not once has there ever been a recorded instance of a truly beneficial mutation, one which is a known mutation and not merely a reshuffling of latent characteristics in the gene. Nor such a mutation has that was permanent, passing on from one generation to another. So they assume it happens and it starts passing on and it gets to take over the whole population. A Koskler, each mutation occurring alone would be wiped out before it could be combined with others. They are all interdependent. The doctrine that their coming together was due to a series of blind coincidences is an affront not only to common sense, but the basic principles of scientific explanation. It's wishful thinking, it's daydreaming, and it's just an affront to science. The fourth problem, harmful effects. Nearly all mutations are harmful. In most instances, mutations weaken or damage the organism in some way so that it or its offspring, if it's able to have any, will not long survive. Here's a quote from H. Herbert Nielsen. There is no single instance where it can be maintained that any of the mutants studied has a higher vitality than the mother species. It is, therefore, absolutely impossible to build a current evolution on mutations or on recombinations. Another quote from H.J. Mueller. It is entirely in line with the accidental nature of mutations that extensive tests have agreed in showing the vast majority of them are detrimental to the organism in its job of surviving and reproducing, just as changes accidentally introduced into any artificial mechanism are predominantly harmful to its useful operation. Good ones are considered so rare that they are that we cannot consider them all bad. Another quote from T. Dobzhansky, a geneticist. A majority of mutations, both those arising in laboratories and those stored in natural populations, produce deteriorations of the viability, heredity, and disease in monstrosities. Such it changes, it would seem, can hardly serve as an evolutionary building block. Few examples of beneficial quotations. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria. They've actually found a frozen sailor who froze in the 1830 before they had antibiotics, and he had those in his stomach. So it wasn't a matter of mutations causing that. It was just some that were designed that way were resistant to bacteria. Lactose tolerance in Europeans. Actually, they found that milk is not so good for once you get beyond the age of 5, and it does cause a lot of problems. And if you didn't have anything to drink but milk, I guess it might be a bad thing. But even them, all they get is kind of indigestion after drinking it. It's not like it's going to make them pass out or anything like that, but it's not a good idea to drink much milk. Resistance to HIV, and this is very rare, and it's just inferior problem in the genetics that it can it doesn't have the right things to take on the HIV. Sickle cell anemia. This is a horrible mutation to cells, and it makes a person much sicker overall. And maybe they can fight malaria better, but as living a life and passing it on is not a good mutations. A fail to meet the requirements of an increasingly genetic complexity mutation. All fail that. Epigenetics, and this is something kind of new. And a lot of the changes they talk about, oh, these mutations are great. It's actually epigenetics, and there's markers in the DNA. And epigenetics are biochemical markers placed on the top of DNA to control which genes are switched on and off, allowing cells to express different genes at different times and carry out various specialized function. Epigenetic changes are heavily influenced by our lifestyle, environment, and can be reversed. Well, this just isn't one cell, it's to a whole millions of cells in the body. And somehow they get the message, I guess there's a radio wave sent out, and they do that. A lot of biologists says, oh, it's got to be by mutations. No, it goes back and forth. And so this is the sign that of design, and I don't know how mutations made these, if they made the DNA. Evolutionary biologist Dr. Richard E. Lewinsky initiated a long-term experiment in February 24, 1988, which continues today. Its goals is to look for genetic changes in 12 initially identified populations of E. coli bacteria that have been adapting to conditions in their class for more than 68,000 generations. I think it's over 80,000. The finding of the study so far: mutations that result in a gain of novel information have not been observed. They're looking for these great changes, and they weren't observed. They did adapt to the pink petri dishes or whatever they were, but they would die if they got outside them. So you can hardly consider that an improvement. Here's a quote: my attempts to demonstrate evolution by experiment carried on for more than 40 years have completely failed. At least I should hardly be accused of having started with any preconceived anti-evolutionary standpoint. He's talking about the E. coli bacteria again. So he's saying I kind of disproved evolution, but it wasn't because I started out with the idea that evolution was wrong. Here's a quote from T. Dublinsky: a majority of mutations, both those arising in laboratories and those stored in natural populations, produce deteriorations to the viability, heredity, disease, and monstrosities. Such changes, it would seem, can hardly serve as evolutionary building blocks. The Human Genome Project was another big project. I think they were going to try to prove evolution, and I think it disproved evolution, and but they couldn't really talk about it. If they talk about it, they wouldn't get any more funding in the future. But fortunately, some other people looked at the evidence, and one very important one was Dr. John J.C. Stanford. He wrote the book Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. And what he did, he actually was a genetic specialist, but he did it with plants, but he knew all about genetics. And he had over, I think, 100 patents, and he made the gene gun, and he was a brilliant man. Well, he'd stopped and looked at the results from the Genome Project, and he said, hey guys, this is genetic entropy. And you can find him on YouTube or get his book, and you can understand more. And so he realized they found out that evolution isn't true, that evolution is a lie. And actually, he became a Christian and actually a young earth creationist after his investigation of the Human Genome Project. So what is genetic entropy? It is the genetic degeneration of living things. Genetic entropy is the systematic breakdown of the internal biological information systems that make life alive. They say, well, not in an open system. Well, not in material things. It could be maybe in energy, but they never observed it. So don't believe that when they say not in open systems. Entropy happens to everything and everybody. So Specific theories versus observation. DNA is lost each and every generation. Where's the evolution in that? Nobel Prize winning grandfather of modern human genetics, Hermann Muller, established in 1950 that a mutation load of 0.3 mutations per individual per generation was the limit of human mutational tolerance. And he understood, and he wasn't afraid. He's sure that it was true. Here's another quote. 1971 fellow Nobel Prize winner Manfred Egan also calculated that the maximum number of mutations allowed for evolutionary was to process as one per gene, one mutation or one per genome. Any figure above that would eventually result in genetic error catastrophe, a term he coined. So that was a big problem. Anything higher would be error catastrophe as far as the whole evolution story. So the Genome Mapping Project found that between 100 and 300 mutations were added in each generation. Stanford believes this information is known but guarded by population geneticists. Humanity is degenerating at a rate as high as 1% per generation. He concludes we are in a downward spiral. So this was Dr. J.C. Stanford, a quote from him. And this is what he found. And they don't want us to do it because it's guarded by them. Here's some geneticists that were also observed it, and Dr. Crow, geneticist, says, and these are interesting quotes, we're inferior to cavemen. So the cavemen were not so dumb. They were superior to us, supposedly. Dr. Kroshoff, we had a couple quotes from him. No human geneticist doubts man is degenerating. Dr. Lentz, even assuming a lower mutation rate, we are degenerating at 1 to 5% per generation, and that just could not have gone on for 120,000 years. Here's the link. Jacob C. Tennyson, he said, evolution and functional impact of rare coding variations from deep sequences of human exomes conclude the degradation couldn't have been going on for a long period. He says the maximum likelihood time for accelerated growth was a maximum of 5,115 years ago. Based on the evidence, he came up with this. We think it's about 6,000 years ago, but we don't think before the flood they had that many. So he says it couldn't have been going on as a maximum of that. I think we could stretch it out to Adam and Eve without a problem, but I think he was right. Alexander Christoph, he says, why have we not died 100 times over? That's assuming that we have been around for 120,000 years. We would have been wiped out at least 100 times, is what he's saying. Here's Francis Collin, the leader of the Human Genome Project, and he was an evolutionist. He became a creationist, a Christian, after the genome problem. He says this evidence alone of genetic similarities between humans and chimps does not, of course, prove a common ancestor from a creationist perspective. Such a similarities could simply demonstrate that God used successful design principles over and over again. And I believe he's absolutely right that this commonality points to a common designer, not a common ancestor single cell. Spitner, PhD, the neo-Darwinians would like us to believe that the large evolutionary changes can result from a series of small events if there are enough of them, but even if those events all lose information, they can't be the steps in the kind of evolution the neo-Darwinian theory is supposed to explain. No matter how many mutations there are, whoever thinks macroevolution can be made by mutation that lose information is like the merchant who lost a little money on every sale but thought he could make it up in volume. It's not going to be made up in volume, and you're not going to get macroevolutions from these microevolutions. Joseph Wells, time is, in fact, the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible becomes probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles. However, the laws of science suggest a problem with this idea. Those laws tell us very clearly that with time things degrade. They do not become better. Scientifically speaking, then time is the enemy of evolution. It's not the friend. It's not the great hero. It's not the great God. It is the enemy. Here's the 2016 meeting of the London Royal Society. It's called the Royal Society now. And they see a problem in Darwinianism. They think, and had the meeting. They said, let's get together and find the solution. They were the ones who supported Darwin's story originally. They supported neo-Darwinian evolutions. Now they saw the problem in 2016, but they got a lot of problems. They're not going to talk about it anymore. But here's what they said. Darwinian theory is broken and may not be fixable. That was a takeaway from a meeting last month organized by the world's most distinguished and historic scientific organizations, which went mostly unreported by the media. The conference did an excellent job of defining the problem that evolutionary theory has failed to solve, but it offered little, if any, by the way of new solution to those long-standing fundamental problems. Continue. The origin of organism form, although the neo-Darwinian paradigm still represents the central explanatory framework of evolution as represented by recent textbooks, it has no theory of the generative. In other words, the neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutations and natural selection lacks the creative power to generate the novel anatomical traits and forms of life that have arisen during the history of life. These are 100 scientists. They all signed this letter, and it's a dissent from Darwinism. And this statement, a scientific dissent from Darwinism, is a short statement that reads, we are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutations and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Well, they don't want to do that because they'd have to admit that they were wrong. And evolutionary theory needs a high rate of beneficial mutation, and for those mutations to create new information over time. Both of these assumptions are now clearly false. There are virtually no beneficial mutations. Those that exist create no significant new information, and there is not enough time. The prime axiom of evolution that mutations lead to an upward genetic process is therefore a lie. That's what they had in their paper. There's no experimental evidence for the mutation over time scenario of evolution. It's a Darwinian illusion and his disciples' delusion akin to religion. Here's a quote from S. Lathrop, he said, micro mutations do occur, but the theory that these alone can account for evolutionary change is either falsified or it's else an unfalsified, hence a metaphysical theory. I suppose that nobody will deny that it is a great misfortune if an entire branch of science becomes addicted to a false theory, but this is what has happened in biology. I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will rank the greatest deceit in the history of science. When this happens, many people will pose the question, how did this ever happen? Biologists, if you argue with anybody, they'll say, well, you're not a biologist. You're not a biologist. Well, I don't trust biologists, and neither does S. Lathrop. And they've all been indoctrinated in the lie that evolution is a fact. Conclusion: upon rigorous examination and analysis of any dogmatic assertion that gene mutations are the raw material for an evolutionary process involving natural selection is an utterance of a myth. John Moore. Evolution cannot succeed without mutation, and evolution cannot succeed with them. Evolution is an impossibility. Only God can make plants and animals. No one else can, and the senseless, random, harmful mutations can't do it. Either mutations are evolution's end, it's not the engine. It is the end. Mutations prove that evolution is wrong, and they couldn't find a better explanation. Evolution is unproven and unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. Well, I think everybody who went through this video should think about it and trust that there is a creator God, that he is the God of the Bible, and then find out about Jesus, that he was the creator God and he came down to solve the problem of sin and died on the cross for our sins. We have to look to the cross and trust in him. Lean on him totally, that he is the solution, and then we will be saved. So any questions? Leave them below.